Professional builders seem able to create stunning landscapes and vegetation with ease, despite it being one of the hardest things to master. It's something that takes more than just knowing how to do it, but also where and when to use it. However, things like trees and cliffs are surprisingly easy if you know how to make them. With enough knowledge and practice, you can master the technique that has eluded so many. So keep watching, and you'll soon learn the many tricks and nuances of organic terraforming. First, we have to discuss what organic terraforming is. Terraforming as a whole is basically just altering a landscape around a build or as a build itself. It can be as large as making a whole mountain, custom trees, or just a small garden in front of a house. In this video, I'll only be focusing on organics, just how to make and use trees and plants. If you want to see more about how to make stunning cliffs, mountains, or waterfalls, I would suggest checking out my other video, which will be linked at the end of this one. The purpose of organic detail is surprisingly simple: adding life to a build. Often, builds can look dry or boring, even when they themselves are wonderfully detailed. This lack of life or character is often not a result of what's missing in a build, but what's missing around a build. For example, this temple looks boring without any vegetation, but as we can see here, adding plants to it gives it far more life and character. Terraforming can also add depth and detail to builds and landscapes. Let's say you've built a wonderful cliff or house, but you're not sure what it's missing. More often than not, the answer is a little bit of life. Take, for example, this cliff. It has depth, detail, and even some color gradients to enhance the overall feel of it. However, it still seems lacking. The fact is, many cliffs have trees or vegetations of some form, as we can see on this side. Even adding a few trees can add a completely new layer of depth and detail that makes this cliff go from barren, dry, and boring to being full of depth, detail, and life. This brings us to our next point. Vegetation is everywhere. In real life, every building, structure, or environment has some form of vegetation. Thus, if you were trying to replicate real life, you should also strive to put plants in your builds. However, you should bear in mind trying to fit the atmosphere of a piece. For example, a suburban home might have a garden in front, a few trees in the yard, and some vines creeping up the side. In other words, you don't need to build a whole rainforest for your build, just some small details that enhance it. Also, when creating a landscape, plants should follow a logical placement. For example, in this garden, we can see geometric lines of bushes and a few straight trees placed in the corners of the garden. This creates a very manicured feel that complements the fountain and stone walkway. However, in this abandoned temple, plants are arranged in a chaotic manner. They are placed randomly and without a pattern, and this helps create a decrepit and undiscovered feeling. In other words, the style of the vegetation should complement the style of the overall structure. Plants should also be placed in areas where you would expect to see them in real life. For example, on this cliff, plants are spaced out and placed on ledges. Plants, especially trees, need stable ground to grow on, so they are placed on flatter areas with dirt. This tree, for example, is on this small ledge, while these are the top of this arch. Also, note that the tree on the ledge is smaller. This has a dual purpose. First, the tree on the small lower ledge will often be smaller in real life, and it creates a small amount of forced perspective by not dwarfing the cliff like the other trees. Scale is a topic I will cover in a later video, but you should always seek to make sure that your vegetation is the right size compared to your structure. If this tree was the size of the others, it would make this cliff seem shorter than the other trees and hide this whole area in the corner. By making it smaller, we achieve the same effect and still have some vegetation lower, but it still makes the cliff seem taller, giving it more interesting detail and makes it seem more realistic. Also, you should bear in mind that the plants themselves should have a certain amount of chaos. For example, these trees have slight curves that make them seem more interesting than just being straight lines or cones. In this way, all plants, especially trees, have some degree of randomness and uncertainty. However, they should still be sensible. They should not, for example, twist wildly in 3 different directions, as that would simply be unrealistic. However, some trees do have interesting or unusual shapes, especially in certain circumstances. For example, this tree in the corner is bending outward away from the cliff and towards the light out of its shadow, which would be quite common to see here. Also, this tree at the end leans out over the cliff as it's lacking support on this side to keep it stable and upright. In other words, plants should be chaotic and varied, but still grow the way you would expect them to in real life. However, there are a few noticeable exceptions to this. If you are trying to create a certain atmosphere or style, especially one associated with a more fantasy or sci-fi feeling, it can be useful to abandon reality for designs that fit the overall style better. For example, this tree here has long, hanging leaves that only a few normal tree species have. However, if this was used in a fantasy or alien forest, it would look perfectly at home. This comes back to the earlier purpose of terraforming complementing the theme. If your overall style is not meant to mimic Earth, your terraforming should not either. While realism is important, it is more important to stay true to the atmosphere than to stay true to reality. In a similar way, using shapes that appear too geometric or orderly can also work well. For example, this garden uses trees that are almost exactly the same, and the landscaping has 2 lines of symmetry that bisect it. This, in turn, seems almost too perfect. Most gardens or landscapes will not be this ordered or similar, as small differences are natural. However, because this garden is meant to seem ordered, manicured, and well tended, this fits the overall atmosphere of the build. It is important, though, to make sure not to overuse this and only to do it in certain dedicated circumstances. One of the hardest parts of terraforming is, of course, trees. However, much of the difficulty in trees is trying to create perfect trees, but this is actually misguided. No tree in real life is perfect or flawless, and you need to embrace that. Instead of trying to create perfect trees, just try to make your trees unique and acknowledge their flaws. However, there are some certain characteristics that are important to know to serve as a guideline for creating trees. First, though, we need to accept that there are many different types of trees, and they can vary widely from broad oaks to tall pines and beautifully cherry blossoms, excluding the many different types and styles that one can find in fantasy or fiction. When creating trees, it is thus important to try and cement the type and style of the tree you are trying to create, and to use the same general guideline for all of your trees. For example, all of the trees here use spruce wood and a leaf gradient from spruce leaves to acacia leaves. Unfortunately, gradients in depth, as well as more detailed information on trees, is a bit out of the scope of this video, so please consider subscribing to support the channel and get recommended more of this content, such as the dedicated video on trees I will release later. Now, the general guidelines for trees are this. First, trunks and branches grow upwards and towards light, similar to what we saw with the trees on the cliff. Also, trees tend to spread out if they are in a clump with open space around them. Finally, branches come off the trunk at various points, especially at one point, and grow both smaller and more numerous as you go outward. We can see this here as it goes from one trunk to a few one-block branches, and then spreads out into a variety of branches made from fences and fence gates. Also, trees are not just spheres. When making trees, it is best to lay them out by first making branches, then filling around the branches. Here, a few blocks around each branch are filled out in clumps, and there are some spaces between branches, but this is natural, and if you plan out the branches correctly, you should be left with a roughly spherical shape. Finally, you can use gradients to enhance your trees. You can either just make the bottom darker or the top lighter, or make more shadowed areas darker and highlighted areas lighter to increase the feeling of depth. This can get very complicated quickly, so we'll make a whole new video on just trees later, but this is probably all you need to know at the moment. Now, you probably hear me talking a lot about terraforming and creating full landscapes. So, if you want to hear more about creating large-scale landscapes and other non-organic terraforming, watch this video here.